All right, now go live.
Now what do we do?
Okay, we're live now. We're on YouTube now. I think everything looks great.
Is
Okay.
is the screen sharing okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
It works for me.
Yeah. Okay.
So let me first quickly introduce our distinguished guest this time. So today we're very, very happy to have Professor Andy Beveridge and Professor Margo Anderson joining us to discuss the issues of the 2020 census, which is a very important and timely topic. And I believe everyone know Andy here. He was our department chair for many years until 2018. And then Professor Margo Anderson is the distinguished professor emerite at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And then let's just get started and let's talk about the census right now.
Okay, let me back up here. Okay. Yeah, so some of you know me. I'm Andy Beveridge. I was in the department for since 81 actually. And I was chair forever from 2006 to 2018. Since I've retired, I've been working on a number of things. People know, I think, some of the work I've been doing. I've been doing a lot with the New York Times. They actually extended our contract for 2 more years. We're still working with Social Explorer, which CUNY has a license to, and in fact, we'll have, I think, a permanent license to, because one of the provisions of having CUNY have a license was that it was free until I retired, and we're negotiating a deal. So, which pleases us because we were going to get some money. CUNY's a heavy user of Social Explorer. Social Explorer has both the 2020 census and the American Community Survey, which is the data set that most people end up using up in it. And then I've also, a thing that I really haven't talked too much about when I was in the department, I do a fairly large amount of litigation consulting. And so in this redistricting round, I did a case in Illinois, a case in Georgia. Illinois is for the Legal Defense and Education Fund of the NAACP. Georgia was Southern Poverty Law Center, and then also West Feliciana, Louisiana, which is a small county in Louisiana, New Rochelle. I think that's it. There may be 1 or 2 others I'm forgetting. But so basically, I'm really into the census, and I got involved with a group of people. Margo is one. We're sort of like sometimes I think we're kind of like the gang of 5 or 6 that are quite concerned with the quality of the 2020 census. And so Margo, who is a distinguished professor, Wisconsin-Milwaukee, historian, she is like the historian of the census, basically. Well, there might be others that are trying, but she's written two very major books on the U.S. Census, plus is co-editor of the what's it called, the Encyclopedia of the Census.
Census, yeah.
Yeah, with Joe Salvo from who was at was chief demographer and was the demographer of planning in New York. So I've used the census data quite a lot, and we were quite concerned about the 2020 census, both because this guy won in 16, and also because of some things that they were going to do to make it to so-called make the data more secure. So we started kind of, there's a group of us that have gone to a few conferences and done sessions together. We're planning to do another one. I've done another presentations at various places regarding some of these changes. and Margo organized an amicus brief that I was on about one of the issues that we're going to raise here. So what I thought I would do is quickly go through sort of some of the basics, because the census is very arcane, you know, even though it's very important and it's very fundamental, it's also very arcane. And so I'm going to just go through and try to hit some of the arcane high points and discuss the various threats that the various attacks or threats the 2020 census had, and then we'll discuss potential implications of some of those threats. So and this is basically drawn from a paper that Margo and I are that's going to be published in May in this new journal. Well, I don't know how new it is, called the New Labor Forum, which is published by the CUNY School for Labor and Urban Studies, and so that was really the impetus for this, the things that we're presenting today. But we're going to keep going, and so that's kind of like the backdrop. Let's see, how do I go forward on this thing? Oh, there we go. So the census is mandated by the Constitution and is collected every 10 years. And it has been collected every 10 years since 1790. And its fundamental use of the Constitution was to apportion Congress. In other words, figure out how many Congress seats each state gets in Congress. And it's also now used to redistrict every legislative body in the United States that has districts. And that includes states, cities, counties, towns, villages, court districts, you know, city councils, school districts, really anywhere there are districts. I mean, just if you think about districts, there are something like, I believe it's 6,000 just state legislative districts in the United States. And there are something like 53,000 political divisions that are reflected in the census, and there are actually more political divisions than that. And so the census is those are really its two fundamental uses, except that there's also a third one or another one, which is to allocate money. And so a guy at George Washington, Andrew Reamer, figured out that $1.5 trillion of federal funds yearly, as well as an untold amount of state and local funds, are actually allocated by the census. So unlike some data sets that we have a tendency to use, which are samples and which basically are collected for research purposes, you have to remember that the census is really collected to divvy up power and money. And it is constitutionally mandated, but it is a data set that you can use for research, but it's also fundamentally a data set that's used to divvy up the politics in the United States. And the famous statement about Harold Lasswell was that politics is a question of who gets what, when, where, and that's exactly what the census does. And then in the 60s, and you probably have all heard about this, something called the Voting Rights Act was passed. It may be on life support given the current Supreme Court, but the Voting Rights Act tried to protect the rights of so-called cognizable groups, which includes Native Americans, Hispanics, Asians, Native Hawaiian, or other Pacific Islanders, and Blacks. And so that means that the census has to collect data among those groups. It also means that it has to collect data, total count data, but it also has to collect data that's voting age population, because the Voting Rights Act works based upon voting age population. And so the, hold on here. What did I do? Okay, I'm going to share it again. I lost my share screen. Here we go.
I'll pick it up while you're chasing it. In other words, that the back to Andy, so that the implications of the quality of the count and whether it's fair are hot button issues every decade when you do it. We've done the census 24 times. It's a fairly rare event, which means that most of us don't remember the last time or the time before that. But this year was a particularly fraught one because of everything, not because of the census so much, but what else was going on in the country. Right. So here we have, to state the obvious, because of the constitutional grounding, the U.S. didn't have the choice really of saying, well, we'll wait till the pandemic's over and then do it. So we had to conduct and count the population during a pandemic, during a presidential election year, and all of the attendant problems with that.
Yeah,
So,
the one other thing that it's used for is it's the baseline for all other government data collection activities, or it has been, and it's also used. It's used for virtually all federal surveys. When those actually then are used by the survey and research industry to balance out many of their surveys. So it's a fundamental data collection, and it's political, but I think it's fundamentally political. It's a fundamental data collection that's used in many ways in research, but it's fundamentally a political data collection. And that's, I think, what makes it somewhat different than a survey, and of course, it's also is an enumeration. It goes to every single household or housing facility in the United States. So unlike every other data collection, it's supposed to be complete. I think because of that, I can't get the thing to move forward. There we go. All right, so and it's self-administered this time. There was information on the relationship with the household. It really doesn't collect very much data. It just collects who's in the household, what's the relationship of each person to what they call now PICO, the person in column 1, which used to be called the householder, or it used to be called the head of household, now it's called the householder. And they asked age, sex, racial or Hispanic identification for every resident. They ask if the unit is occupied or vacant. For redistricting purposes, that's all they give. They also asked if it's owned or rented. And so then the data are processed and tabulated for every state, county, city, town, village, Native American tribal area, voting tabulation district in the United States. And then for redistricting purposes, they create data down to the census block level, which is 8.2 million blocks. So it's a massive undertaking. It costs $18 billion roughly, and they're already planning for the 2030. So that's kind of the background. Now, what happened? Obviously, there was the pandemic, and we'll discuss that in a minute. But the Trump administration, unlike any other administration that's happened, I think, in my lifetime, directly after it took office, started to bend the census to its agenda. And they wanted to manipulate the information collected and released from the census so that they could bias the allocation of legislative seats through the process of reapportionment redistricting, and it would be to the advantage of Republicans. And as one of their main, what they call him the redistricting genius, Tom Hofer, said bluntly, it will to favor non-Hispanic whites and Republicans and to disfavor Latinos and by extension other non-citizen groups that have substantial non-citizens, and also by extension blacks. And there was two efforts that they did on this. The first was they wanted to add the citizenship question to the census, and they wanted to do that basically so they could get rid of non-citizens from redistricting, and they also wanted to get rid of kids. So the whole idea was they would switch the denominator of all redistricting from total population, which is what it is now. The districts are divided by total population, regardless of whether they're citizens. It's a total population in full stop, and they're supposed to be relatively equal. So they were trying to get rid of, basically, they didn't want to, in effect, have any representation for non-citizens, for kids, and they were quite willing to diminish the representation for other non-Hispanic, non-Hispanic groups. And there was, to do this, they tried to put a question on the form. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then later on, or actually it was probably planned all along, they wanted to identify the undocumented immigrants and then exclude them altogether from the census release. This had never, this sort of bubbles up, this kind of stuff, but it had never actually been seriously tried by a administration. And then the pandemic made it hard to count, made it hard, what are areas that are considered hard to count, harder to count, because since the form was mostly, a tremendous fraction of the data collection was done by computer. And, if you're in an area with what's called, an internet desert, it would be hard to collect. The libraries were closed. They didn't expect to use the libraries, for people who didn't have easy access to computers for filling out. So there's evidence that one person we've dealt with, Connie Citro, found that there was a serious increase in undercount. And then they came up with some new procedures. Purportedly, we're not going to really talk very much about this, but purportedly, and this wasn't really done by Trump. This was done by the Bureau itself, but they came up with new procedures to purportedly protect privacy, and it added unknown heirs to many census counts, apparently to the detriment of Blacks and Latinos. And so that's what they did. And now I think Margo should talk about, maybe you should take over and discuss how this,
okay,
the nasty things they do.
Right. So, as Andy said, we come at these questions from slightly different places. He comes at it as a sociologist, founder of Social Explorer,
A data user.
And a user, And I come at it. I'm sort of a user, but I'm mostly an historian. So, and what I realized many years ago, around the time that Andy was taking his job at Queens, was that that the census was much more important to the stability of the American political system than was understood at the time, which is why I then spent some time writing this. This is the second edition of this book. The first one came out in '88. And then after that, spent a lot of time studying the politics of the census and the integration of what I call the politics of population into the larger issues of the American state. So I worked on the undercount issues and have worked on issues of confidentiality and privacy and the misuse of data. My basic background is as an urbanist and so forth. So when Trump took office in 2017, there were already rumors that he and his administration were going to try to sort of mess with the census, which at that point is 3 or 4 years away. But as Andy said, because the planning is so elaborate, things were pretty far along by then. And there are in law, these sort of deadlines to tell the Congress and the American people sort of where we are, what we're up to this decade. And in 2017, the Trump administration essentially let slip the deadline in the spring. There's 3 years before the count and 2 years before the count. They let slip the April 1st, 2017 deadline. But in 2018, when that deadline came around, which was basically to tell Congress what questions were going to be on the form, Wilbur Ross, the Secretary of Commerce, said, "Oh, we're going to put a citizenship question on the form." Now, the census now is a pretty simple and small survey. It's like 8 or 10 questions. The slogan was 10 questions in 10 minutes. Right, that's all. Adding a citizenship question was completely unprecedented. There had never been a question on citizenship on the census asked of all Americans. We had asked the question of where people were born since 1850. And of course, that would identify if you were born overseas and not a birthright citizen. But and in the late 19th and early 20th century, when there was a great deal of foreign immigration, Congress added questions on, well, have you been naturalized? Did you take out your citizenship papers and so forth? But those were only asked to the foreign-born because they didn't apply to the native-born population. So Ross's proposal sent shockwaves not only through the immigrant communities, but because of Trump's anti-immigrant focus, but also through the data communities, because you could see almost immediately that they had no idea how to do it, and what resulted, long story short, was within a month, there were what turned out to be 3 major federal lawsuits, one in New York, one in Maryland, one in California, challenging Ross's authority to do what he was trying to do, which, again, long story short, ended up with the Supreme Court supporting the litigants, saying, no, you can't do this. You haven't done the prep work. You haven't done the planning. This is going to damage the census. So by June 2019, it was the Trump administration was banned from doing that. This is where Andy and I teamed up on some of the amicus briefs that historians and sociologists put in. I worked on one of the California cases, and I think I must have filed 4 or 5 amicus briefs on the history of the census during that period. Okay.
Which, by the way, the government got completely wrong.
Yeah, but that's a different issue, right? So
I think a quick point has to be the census used to have so-called long form and short form up through, I think they started that in 40. And then in 2000, they basically made the census only the short form, and they moved the long form to the American Community Survey. So citizenship was asked on the American Community Survey, and
but even again, there's more arcane technical stuff there. But the point is that Ross was claiming, oh, we're just reinstating what we used to do, and it turned out that was factually wrong, and he lost the case.
And we needed to enforce the Voting Rights Act.
Right. Yes.
No one took seriously. I mean, but except that he got and the Department of Justice didn't think they needed it. They used ACS for
So the upshot of it was that the census was already in the crosshairs of all the political controversies that the Trump administration generated. By 2018, very clearly publicly, and it looked like in sort of the second half of 2019 that things were going to sort of settle down. And then, of course, what happened is that the pandemic hit. And so all the very careful planning that had been done for 7 or 8 years, which was heavily technology based, the internet option, the mobilization of stakeholder groups to encourage count, the advertising campaigns, the timing of when you would send out enumerators when they weren't getting answers, all of that what was thrown into chaos when the country locked down in March of 2020. The Bureau then turned around and like everybody else and said, whoops, we've got to, we have to do this, but we're going to have to slow it down and postpone. So they kept the internet option going, which frankly, I think saved their bacon in a lot of ways. But the field enumeration, which is designed for special populations and anybody who's hard to count. College students are a huge issue in this census because they were all sent home. They weren't physically where they were where they might normally would have been counted on April 1st. The homeless, people who, if the address register that they're using to deliver the forms or deliver the postcard with the code to fill it out, if that doesn't reach someone because they've moved to their summer house to get out of the city, all of that went into a cocked hat. On top of that, in the summer of 2020, the Trump administration recognized that their re-election possibilities were shakier than they thought. And so Trump doubled down on the Census Bureau and said, I want the undocumented count. You people, and the Bureau had done this. The Bureau had said, don't put it on the form. We can figure out how to estimate it with modeling. And Trump took them up on that and said, okay, fine, do that too. And instead of postponing this, we can postpone some of the field administration, but don't postpone the reporting because I want the reports done while I'm still president, which basically meant December 31st, 2020, so that I can control it. Well, that led to another flurry of lawsuits. In some ways, a lot of chaos in the field administration in July, August, and September. Untold debates about untold questions that we still don't have the answer of about about the intervention of, quote, political appointees that Trump put into the Bureau, new deputies for this and that and the other thing. So all of that turmoil hit in the second half of 2020 and frankly didn't really settle down until Joe Biden won the election and then took office and essentially repealed all the executive orders that Trump had put in place in January.
Yeah, he did it actually on the first day.
Yeah, he did it on the first day.
It was one of the things he did actually the first day in office, which
right.
He got rid of the attempt to see. The other thing they did was they tried, the census wanted to keep counting and then keep processing, and they wanted an extension,
right, to hurry it up,
release pattern, and which would their normal release. They released the apportionment data by January 1st, and then they released the redistricting data by the end of March, and the census wanted basically, I think, 3 more months.
Yeah, they did, and so
and what happened was Trump, they never passed it, and Trump, ordered them to do it. The group quarters count was a mess. Group quarters are like prisons the main ones are prisons and college dorms. They were just a mess. So the finally resisted, but the director that was in at that time, a Trump director, was going to pay bonuses if they got the data out the door before Trump left office. So it was like a shit show, basically. And they also shut down all of the operations that should have been going into basically on through the winter to some extent, including both some field operations, but also more importantly, a lot of the processing. So God knows, what happened.
Let's get to the end of the story and back to where we are now. So essentially Biden's election began to turn, the aircraft carrier, if you will. The Bureau brought out the apportionment numbers in which are, allocating the congressional seats in April of 2021. In August of 2021, they brought out the redistricting file that Andy's talked about. But as that was happening, data users and everybody is sort of saying, yeah, but look at all the problems that we had from the last 3 or 4 years. How good is this data? Can we use it for the next 10 years? And again, this is the issue, which is you didn't have a choice not to collect it in the first place. And we don't really have a political solution at the moment to say, is it what in census jargon is called fit for use? But there's lots of worry. So here we are in 2022, 6 months out, say 8 months out from the last release, and we don't have anything, we don't have new information yet. In 2010, the last census, the redistricting file came out in March of 2010, and the next rollout of data, which are the detailed tabulations for all the local governments with lots more, with age and sex and so forth information in them, started rolling out in June, 2 months later. We're in a holding pattern now, and potentially one that will go well into later this year or beyond. And that has raised the question, the new sets of questions about, well, what is the quality of the 2020 census, and what are the implications of one not publishing it at all, some of it at all, which is one of the proposals is like, well, we just won't use it for this decade the way we used to. Or what if we do, what is happening is that users, state and local governments, private organizations and so forth are beginning to discover what are affectionately called anomalies in the information. In other words, numbers that don't make sense. Then what do we do about that? And that's where we are now. And it affects lots of things. Is there an undercount in this? Is it bigger or smaller than it used to be? We've had traditional problems with undercounting small children in the census. Did the 2020 census do better or worse than that? We have no data published yet on children, except for the very crude distinction in the redistricting file that breaks down the population into two categories: 18 and older, voting age, and 17 and below, children. No sex reporting yet, so we don't know boys and girls. No single years of age, no owner renter, right? And so forth. So that's where we are. And let me stop there, and Andy can add, and then we can do some questions.
Well, the one other thing that's sitting there, one of the reasons that there's a huge delay now for the rest of the data, it's called the rest of the data, what that is. But there's a huge delay because they put in this system of so-called disclosure avoidance, and they don't know how to run it yet for the rest of the data. It appears to have caused some damage in the redistricting side to the minority communities because it makes it harder to draw. What they did was they put so-called noise into every count, and they put out 6 demonstration products with the noise. This was all done internally. This is a bureaucratic problem. This isn't a Trump problem. This is not a pandemic problem. This is a self-inflicted wound. And so but because of this, they've delayed and are scrapping the publication of lots of the rest of the data. And so how that will play out, we don't know. Margo's on a panel is supposed to tell us how good the data are. There was another panel by the American Statistical Association that was going to tell us right away how good are the apportionment data and how good are the redistricting files. They said, well, the apportionment data look okay, but then they kicked down the road to Margo's panel whether the redistricting data are any good. So we're in kind of a situation where we're not quite sure what kind of data we've got. And, a troubling, sort of not a troubling fact, but something that reinforces this is the Census Bureau generally puts out estimates every year. Well, they always put out estimates every year. They generally use the last census as their estimate base. This time around, they're not. They're using what's called the blended base, which is basically they're going to use the housing count, because the housing count was not affected by this disclosure avoidance. So they're going to use a housing count, and then they're doing a bunch of other things to do the estimates. The first set of estimates are coming out in March. And then the next set of estimates come out in June. And their basic thing is we can't trust the data that the 2020 census has created, and it's not released anyway. One of the big things that people use for mortality computation is a file that's race, age, Hispanics, and sex in 5-year groups. That file won't be out, until by county. That file will not be out until the next shot. Some of the rest of the data come out, and whether that file will be any good or not is really anybody's guess. So we're actually in kind of a funny spot. The data are collected, they've been processed. Some of it has been released, sort of the constitutionally mandated portion, right, Margo?
Yeah,
constitutionally
and then
statutorily mandated portion.
Right.
And that's it. And whether Margo for a while was saying she didn't think any more data would come out. I don't know what her position is on that today.
I wait. Right.
Margo's from Wisconsin, but she's really from Missouri.
I just wait. Right.
Yeah. So, but she's on a panel that's supposed to evaluate the data. They won't give her the data to evaluate.
These kind of problems used to hit again in my historical hat in the 19th century. One of the things I do is write about what happened when the census went wrong in the past, and then what did Americans do about it. So this is not a new problem in terms of the census. We can, most of us don't remember it, but the particular wrinkles this time are unprecedented given the last 50, 60 years and so forth, where the capacity of the agency and the federal government to actually collect, tabulate, and publish the data has been fairly reliable, and it isn't this time. Think of the Civil War, right? I mean, we took a census in 1860, and just as the apportionment numbers were coming out in April 8, at that point there was no deadline, April 1861, half the country seceded, right? Think of taking a census during Reconstruction with half the country militarily occupied by the Union Army. So there are many, many cases in the past. Think of collecting the census right before the outbreak of World War II. So there's lots of models.
So maybe we should take questions, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you for such. Oh, I saw Mindy already raise your hand. Just one quick line before we take Mindy's question. Thank you so much for this very informative introduction of the 2020 census and the very insightful discussion of the problems there. And we have a lot of demographers and survey experts here, and then I know they can't wait to ask questions. But for those of you who are on YouTube, I saw like around 15 people there. If you have any question, you can just type your question in the chat section, and I will read your question to our speakers. But here we go, Mindy, your turn.
First of all, thank you very much, Margo and Andy. Very nice to see you. I do have a question, which is that when Rob Santos was put in as census director, who I know, we were all hoping he would kind of be like the messiah for all of this, but we're not really seeing anything yet. And it wouldn't surprise me if he was just bogged down in all political crap that's going on. But I'd like to know your opinion, both of you, about having him as the census director.
Well, first of all, it's good to have a census director in the first place. Interim census directors, which we had from basically May of 2017 until early 2019, I think, are bad for the enterprise because there's no leadership, and the leadership devolves or rises to the Commerce Department and the White House. That's not good. So it's good to have a director. Now, having said that, Santos has a lot on his plate, and we should also mention that the decennial is only one thing that the Census Bureau as an agency, and he's the director of the agency, does. Namely, he's got the American Community Survey, he's got all the demographic surveys, he's got a whole other side, what is called the economic side of the house. All of that he has to get sort of, running smoothly and functioning. And so from my perspective, I'll give him the benefit of the doubt for a while. I think by the summer, people are going to start asking, like, so now what? But at the moment, he's still getting his feet wet from my perspective.
Yeah, I think he's, the problem was, they put in Dillingham, just so to give you an idea, they originally wanted to make this guy Burrell director. Thomas Burnell. His expertise, his professional expertise, he's a political scientist. He's never run anything. I don't even know if he's ever been a department chair, to give you an idea. He's at UTD, University of Texas, Dallas. He was at Binghamton. His professional reputation rests on a book he wrote called Why Non-Competitive Elections Are Good. He was a Republican redistricting consultant, basically. They tried to get him in. Claire McCaskill blocked it. Then they tried to put him in without confirmation as a deputy director. So they were playing games for quite a while. Also, they forced out, Margo doesn't want me to say this, but he came up to me and told me this at a conference, so I think I could say this out loud. They forced out the director before, when Ross got in, he fired the director, basically. So they had no director. Then they put in this guy Dillingham, which everybody sort of like bit their teeth and said, okay, well, this is probably the best we could do under Trump. And then toward the end of his term, he was bribing census, well, not bribing is the wrong word. He was giving bonuses to the census officials if they would get the count out in time so Trump could fuck with it. So this is what so compared to that, Rob's great, but he's got a hell of a lot of things to deal with. Margo's absolutely right. He's got the census, the inaccuracies that have been put in by the Census Bureau into the data, which include things like, there's a friend of mine out in California has got this concept of, there's Lord of the Flies blocks. A Lord of the Flies blocks is a block that only has people under 18 in it. There are blocks that are called mermaid blocks. These are blocks where there's no housing units, but there are people living there, and all that's there is water. This is all an artifact of this new disclosure avoidance. So he's got to deal with all these things. There's going to be more of them coming in. So far, he made noises that he thought the new disclosure avoidance was okay. On the other hand, he stopped them from screwing with this current population survey. So it's a mix. I'd say it's a mixed result so far.
Do you know if he is taking the position that he wants to release the data or that he does not want to release the data?
I don't think that's the issue. The Bureau made a commitment in its planning very late, not until 2018, but they did make a planning decision to use this new disclosure avoidance methodology. And so essentially that shifts the responsibility over to the technical people who have to make it work. And that's, as Andy said, that's been the problem. They haven't been able to literally get the computers and the numbers to come out right. When they did the redistricting file, it took them 6 iterations to get the version that they finally published.
And it still has problems.
Yeah, and it has problems. So
they put out a memo saying, don't use the blocks. Don't use the blocks.
So that's the technical. So presumably, he didn't take office until January. So presumably he's one of the discussions that's going on is about that. And when it became clear in 2018 and 19 that the redistricting file was going to be a problem, they produced what are called demonstration products that allowed the user community to sort of look at what they were proposing and see if they were up to snuff.
Based on the 2010 census.
Basically, they were demonstration products based on the 2010 census.
So you can compare them.
So you could compare what they published in 2010 with what was being proposed using the new method. That's what they took 6 times, and they have not. And they're supposed to do that for the next set of releases, what are called the demographic and housing counts. We haven't gotten that demonstration product yet.
Yeah, they're supposedly going to have one, and I think it's going to be fairly limited in March. What we do know is they're slashing they're slashing what they're planning to release to accommodate this new disclosure avoidance.
Yeah. So
and what I would say the good news for the survey research entity is that two sort of major groups of the Census Bureau are kind of walking away from the 2020 census. The one is the estimates division. That's why they're using the blended base, because they can't trust and can't get the data. The other group that's sort of walked away is the geography division, because they've decided to base rural and urban classification on housing only, and ignore the pop count because they can't trust it. Unless, so it's going to be difficult to use the data. The census data is going to be difficult. So far, they haven't screwed up the ACS, which is what I think, and nor have they screwed up the estimates. So those are all coming out next month and next week, actually. The ACS, the estimates are going to start coming out. So those data are fine, and people could just use those like they have before. And in fact, they put a lot of effort into making sure that the 2020 ACS was okay to use for the 5-year ACS file. So that's coming out on the 15th to 17th. The estimates coming out, I think, on the 10th. They might even come out this week. They usually come out they come out in the middle of March and those are good those are 21. Those are the kind of things people actually use a lot, and so that's the good news. Bad news is that we're going to be talking about the 2020 till 2030 probably. I don't know. The new disclosure avoidance. I mean, Connie Citroth characterized it to me one time as a research project, done in real time. It should have been done as a research project, but they made all sorts of noises about why they had to do it.
Thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you, Mindy. And other people, if you have any question, you can raise your hand or just unmute yourself and speak up.
I think we've silenced the crowd here.
Overwhelmed by the issues of the census and the looming dark, future down the road.
Well, if nobody has a question, I'll jump in once again. So just so you know, I come out of the survey industry, so that's my background, and I used demographic data as part of my thesis, my PhD thesis. So that's kind of the connection. But in the survey industry, we think of the Census Department as sort of heralding a lot of experiments on the best way to word questions, the best way to handle surveys and collect demographic information. And we look to them for what has happened with their experiments. And there's always been transparency in what they've done, the methods that they've used, and the results that they've gotten, and the recommendations that they give. And that, of course, has disappeared between Trump coming in and the main woman in the department who has since retired. So I'm just wondering what you think the prognosis would be in having the census as sort of the premier department to help us in the survey division in understanding these issues.
Yeah, no, that's actually a really good question, because there is a kind of long-term sort of hangover of all this on what I would call the first of all, the federal statistical system, what's going on in all the other agencies that collect information either administratively or through surveys, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, health statistics, CDC, all of those are also going to essentially have the issues that we've been talking about sort of impact them one way or another. So yes, there's a lot there. I mean, for example, one of the things that was done in 2020 was a change in the way the Bureau reported the race classification for in the redistricting file. There was an effort in the middle of the decade to add new categories, the most prominent one being Middle Eastern and North African, MENA. That never was implemented. The Office of Management Budget never authorized it, if you will, so because they authorized the official race classification of the US. But the Bureau went ahead with the operational changes in their data collection procedures as if it was going to happen, and then reported data in August of 2021 on the new categories.
Well, that's worse. It's worse than that. What happened was they had planned to have one question and basically combine race and ethnicity
Together.
Hispanic. They were going to add MENA. But what happened was there was a memo written by a guy at the Heritage Foundation criticizing this. So they've never implemented it. And then the survey people at the Bureau had done an experiment where they also were going to add a fill in the blank for whites and blacks. So they used to only have fill in the blanks for basically the cognizable race categories, basically, except for blacks. So they would ask, but they put in a fill in category for white, a fill in category for black, and they had set up this system to categorize groups if you fill in the blank. So they applied that to all of the fill in the blank categories. So they had fill in the blank for the six basic race categories plus Hispanic. So they use the same system to do it to all. I mean, Turner, who's one of our colleagues, he just couldn't believe it. Yeah, because they had never tested it. And so they ended up with, according to Bill Fry, the estimate was that there was going to be 500,000 more multi-race whites in the United States, and it turned out there were 50 million more. I mean, there were going to be 500,000, it turned out to be 5 million more. So multi-race whites. Yeah, so it's completely screwed up any comparability, and they just did it. And they also blocked. Yeah, they blocked MENA, and then so the Census Bureau kind of went on their own, in my opinion. And I don't know what's going on in the survey methods part of the Bureau, but they used to do very good experiments. I completely agree with you, and I don't know what they're doing now.
So essentially, the turmoil that we've described is, has run through a whole series of what seem like unrelated activities. And so, the description that Andy has that is described that the 2020 census had a write-in fill-in for what I joked with my students is like, what kind of white person or black person are you? They didn't do a crosswalk back to the old categories. So so people like you who are using it, who confront these new numbers, have no way of saying, oh, I see, this is the way this would have been broken down in 2010, and this is what you did in 2020. Pick one, but we don't have the crosswalk.
It increased the percent of non-Hispanic black, of multi-race blacks by a couple of percent, which has a big effect of redistricting.
Yeah. So it's there's lots of there's
so
many.
it had a lot. Yeah. So it's like this was the thing that they hadn't really announced, by the way.
No, they didn't.
Till the day of the release. And there are people in the social science community that, you know, one of which is Richard Alba, that were big on this multi-race stuff. But I mean, I don't think that's the point. The point is that they didn't like make it comparable. And that, you know, and I don't know what Rob might get into that, because Rob is like he is, you know, he was head of both APOR and ASA, American Statistical Association. So he's got the chops. That's my view. And I know him too. And I'm you know, my own guess, I guess, you know, and he's certainly not Dillingham, he's certainly not Burrell. And so you know, it's an improvement, but it is like turning an ocean liner. I don't know how many Margo I know has been to the Bureau. I've been to the Bureau a bunch of times. The Bureau has, just to give you an idea, the Bureau has a 2/5 mile fitness trail entirely in the building. You go down to the Bureau. What?
It's around the building. It's outside. Andy.
No, it's in the building. They have one in the building. They have one in the building. And furthermore, because it might rain, it might snow. They've also one outside the building. I mean, they have both. I mean, I'm not arguing that they, you know, I'm not. But the other thing about it is, you go down the Bureau, you think you've woken up in a Kafka story, because there's like cubicles as far as the eye can see, and the place operates in silo form. Someone told me it's like 69 separate entities.
Well, we're trying to be hopeful, because I know that Rob he must have known what he was up against when he
also uses
this
data,
position.
which is a plus.
And his wife worked in government for a very long time at the FHWA. So I'm sure that he knew, but I could just imagine the bureaucracy that he is dealing with over there and trying to get anything done. So.
Well, Margo thinks he'll be up on the hill all the time, right, Margo?
I don't know how he's going to approach, but I don't even know physically. I mean, this is the other piece which we didn't talk about at all, about what has happened to that Suitland building with 5,000, which has office space for 5,000 people in it. None of whom have been there for the last 2 years. So where physically people are working from, and what they're, Andy's talking about the silos in the building, which are real. And there's all kinds of locked doors because of the need to protect confidentiality and people with different clearances on accessing different parts of the building. But there's just so much yet to be sort of understood about where we are on this, and coming, and it's every agency in the country, public and private, is coming back from the pandemic and confronting, as we talked about before we started, the mold in the building that grew.
Well, that's very good. They had 2 days of telework before pandemic. You did 2 days of telework before pandemic. They have it all set up. I mean, they have that very well set up. And but I think that they also put in, I mean, another thing, if you're talking about the building a minute, they dumped the, what is it called? I think it's an economic something, Bureau of Economic Affairs. They dumped them into the building.
Bureau of Economic Analysis.
Yeah, they're part of
they moved in the building. Yeah.
And they forgot to count, they thought they had plenty of space, but they forgot to take into account all the contractors. So a lot of people have moved into, much more heavily before pandemic, and moved in much more heavily into telework. So, you know, so he's got a lot of things on his plate. And I think he's, you know, I really could see, you know, that, and there were a lot of things that just didn't happen. And then, and there wasn't serious direction since John Thompson left. So between Thompson, who left in, what did he leave in?
May 20, well, he resigned the same day that James Comey was fired in 2017, and he left officially on June 30th of 2017.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the Bureau was leaderless for, again, you know, a year and a half, almost 2 years.
Yeah, and the other thing is that even though, and you, I'm sure you'd understand this, even though the Bureau, you know, has its own way of doing things, they did have to kind of kowtow to Trump, you know, to some extent. And, you know, it's not even, you know, they effectively had a mixed approach to the the citizenship question, which they were against. I mean, you know, they're to a person down there, they were against sticking it on the census, but they couldn't take that as an official position because they're in the, you know, they're in the Commerce Department. And I mean, to give you an example, a friend of mine got a call. This is a great example. A friend of mine got a call and said, opportunity zones were this thing that the Trump administration cooked up where they give you all sorts of tax breaks if you build real estate into an opportunity zone. And they're theoretically supposed to be poor areas. And there was a tract in Baltimore, there was an opportunity zone in Baltimore that was adjacent to an empty tract. And so a person who I know very well gets a call from the White House saying, can't you designate that empty tract as an opportunity zone? And so it went back and forth, back and forth. He said, well, you know, it's not my job, blah, blah, blah. They finally did, Commerce finally did designate it as a opportunity zone. And Ivanka's husband put a real estate development there, Jared. And so that's what they were doing to the
Really a
extent.
hot mess.
And also, I mean, the contracting was probably being done in the same way. And they do a incredible amount of their business contracts. So Margo
Really
will tell us in a few weeks whether it's good data or not, right, Margo?
Mm-hmm.
Well, Margo's on the CNSTAT panel and they have to start reporting. So if they ever let her see the data, we'll know if it's good.
I like the anecdote. We actually have a follow-up question from Holly, and we also got one question from our YouTube audience. Mindy, sorry to cut it off. Do you have more questions? Just now I saw you unmute yourself.
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Thank you
very much, guys.
Then let me read out Holly's question because she cannot unmute right now. She says she wants to follow up on Mindy's question. Let me read it. So she said, Census also has historically been an advisor to many other countries on best practice. I think many of us in the US and abroad were hoping to learn from the new use of the online data collection in the 2020 census. But since we had the perfect storm of Trump and COVID, it was obviously flawed. So do you believe that despite this, there still might be any lessons that can be learned for future censuses and surveys?
If the internet option, if that's what we're referring to here, worked, as I said, I think in fact things would have been worse without it. Because it did allow something like 60% of the addresses on their master address file to report the information, and therefore lessen the burden on the other systems, which were you know, phone, paper, and in person. So in that sense, they did not run into the problems that Australia faced in 2016. So in that sense, that's a model I think that will continue. I mean, it obviously is a function of the how good the internet and systems are in any particular place, and that's again more local knowledge and has to be thought through. But it basically did work.
Thank you, Margo. So internet and online tools will become even more increasingly more important down the road, given the situation.
I mean, it raises, there are some interesting questions, because when the Bureau went to what is called self-enumeration, which they started with the mail census in 1970, the whole dynamic of data collection shifts. So instead of a kind of face-to-face communication between a householder and an enumerator, where any kind of misunderstanding or confusion is supposed to be dealt with by the enumerator. They're supposed to literally talk it through. It raises different questions of how you motivate, explain, what's going on. Again, because most of us don't pay attention to the census and forget so we don't have any memory of it. The way we do, say, with elections, like, oh yeah, I did vote for president 4 years ago. Yeah. So I remember where my voting place is, that kind of thing. So and I've written about that as well, but that's a different, and the internet option presented new advertising challenges for the Bureau, which they basically seem to have met.
Awesome. Thank you. So there's one last question from our YouTube audience. So the question asks, do you know of any proposals for the Congress to amend or clarify the laws that have led to the Bureau of the Census adopting its differential privacy adjustments to the data?
Yeah, no, that's actually that's actually one of the things that I think is going to come up in the next couple of years as a function of where we are now. From Congress's perspective, the management of the digital environment and privacy is just this huge issue, and the census is just one little small piece of a much bigger problem. Facebook, Google, Amazon, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Medical records.
Medical records. I mean, so from Congress's perspective, the question is, tends to get thought about in that context. The statutory language that the Bureau is relying on right now is very old. It was written over a century ago. And I mean, the first version was in 1909, long before anybody ever thought about anything but paper and punch card tabulation. So we're in that's another thing that I've been writing about from the historical perspective, which is, when was the last time we looked at this issue? And really it was in the 70s legislatively. And we passed a law in 1976 called the Mid-Decade Census Act. Believe it or not, we were proposing at that point to take the census every 5 years. It's in law, never did it because Congress never appropriated funding for it. But that was the last time that Congress has taken a serious deep dive into it. It's a half century ago. It's probably time. And it's a matter of figuring out whether the Bureau wants to do that, because they need to be involved, and then whether Congress wants to be involved. All right, so that's where we are.
One of the proposals, I mean, the two things, Margo's not really mentioning this, but there's a view, and it's not the view that they have adopted, that the privacy issue, the current language, and I don't know if it's privacy or confidentiality, was really to prevent the Bureau from handing over the data in ways that it could then be used in a nefarious.
The original legislative initiative was about understanding the distinction of what we would call today the distinction between survey data or research data or administrative data. And so administrative data by definition is identifiable, because that you need it. I want them to keep track of my Social Security contributions since I was 13 years old so that you can pay me a benefit when I get old enough to claim one, right? I need that identity connected to it. That's not true for survey data. And so when the government in the early 20th century began to take on these more administrative functions, both to regulate taxation, regulation, and investigation, as the jargon called it, they began to try to sort out the distinctions of, survey data is anonymized, administrative data is identifiable. If we want to, what if we want to take an administrative data set and like a tax file and turn it into a statistical data set for an economic analysis? Oh, well, we should anonymize that. So that's where the law emerged from. And at the time, essentially, essentially the federal government had the monopoly on the technical capacity of any of this. And it wasn't until the development of the last 30, 40 years and computerization that the private sector sort of caught up with the issues. And now the private sector and the public sector have, in some sense, merged in this very bad and unconfusing way, sharing data with one another, buying data from one another. That all needs to be sorted out.
Mindy, do you have one more question?
Yeah, I'm such a pain in the neck. I'm sorry. So, yeah, I just wanted to mention that, the federal government does a tremendous amount of surveys. And of course, it's not just the Census Bureau that does this. And the whole privacy issue now is front and center. And while the census is saying that their stuff is anonymous and confidential, we have data from the Transportation Bureau, which is being collected house by house, and we know who lives there and where they travel and where they go, and where the address that they start and the address that they end, and all kinds of demographic and geographic information. And that information is given to anybody. So my students, if they're doing analysis,
federal data.
Yeah, it's federal data.
By the
the
way,
names aren't there, but we still know the household number and where they start, the geographic latitude, longitude, where they start and where they end and where they go and who lives there.
And that's exactly, this is exactly the conversation, which is, should this be sample data? If it's sample data, is that provide enough privacy protection, or is there, one of the things that I've raised is that there are, the current legislative environment or legal environment only protects individual level data. In other words, your own identity. It doesn't protect from what is called group harm. In other words, racial profiling, other targeting for some sort of detrimental function based on the group you're in, right? So there's all kinds of issues that again, this is why from my perspective, there needs to be a huge rethink of all of this from exactly what you're talking about. There's fairly good technical work on a lot of it on the Census Bureau website. They've been at the forefront of a lot of it.
Thank you.
In terms of like private data, there are big companies that combine and compile lots of your data, and they are private, so they're not, they should be regulated though, I think. And then furthermore, we were looking at mobility data, that comes out of telephones. And we talked to one company and they have, every telephone, every smartphone has what's called an advertising ID on it. And they are common across Android, Android. This is one thing Android and Apple agree on. And there are something on the order of 232 million devices out there in the United States. And they're all tracked. They all can be tracked. You can buy that data you can buy that tracked data. And they also sell it to the government, by the way. And it's just amazing to me, those sorts of things. The census data, as Margo said, has 10 questions or 7 questions. One of the extra questions is are there any babies we forgot to ask you about, or you forgot to list? So that, so exactly how many data elements they get is probably less than 10. The census data is very mild, age, race, sex, compare that with your medical records, your credit history, all that kind of stuff. I mean, and those data are out there. You can get them. They usually come under a license agreement for the public data. For private data, it's like the devil take the hindmost. I mean, they just, you sign these things when you go on a website. Guess what? You're signing away all your privacy rights when you start using YouTube or Google, Facebook. I mean, this has not been dealt with in the United States at all. There's the Brits, the Europeans have the GDPR, which is much better, and they also have the right of being forgotten on the internet, which is also much better. And I think they got that. The California there may have been a court in California. California has better privacy protection than any state. And even there, the lobbyists got in there. So this is a serious thing. And I think the census is like, who cares about what the census collects? I mean, property data is completely public. I think they're using a nuclear weapon to hit a fly here with the differential privacy.
Yeah, totally. We can see like the technology advancement and pandemic, political disturbance, they all pose threats or challenges to the census, but they also bring up some new opportunities. But one thing for sure is we have entered this era of rapid change, and how can a once in 10-year census really reflect the rapid change in the population is really, really a big issue and a big challenge, challenge. This reminds me of, have you guys heard of the movement? It's like an online movement, but during the election, and also because it's the pandemic, everyone are working from home. So there is kind of like a movement to encourage people in the blue states to move to red states and then to change the population composition there in order to shake up the political landscape. I mean, all this it's all caused by the pandemic and the political disturbance, and also pose more challenge to our census. So I would like to thank both Andy and Margo for this wonderful talk. Thank you for sharing so much information and insights on the census. And I also want to thank all our audience in the Zoom and also on YouTube. Thank you for coming. Do you have some one last words to share with us, Andy and Margo?
Well, the paper will be out in May.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah.
And so we'll make sure, that it's available. If anybody wants to ask for it, we can certainly send it over.
Right, and keep paying attention.
And we have other stuff too that's floating around.
Right.
So but it was good, and I think people don't, the census is an arcane thing, but very important.
Yes, for sure. I will be happy to circulate the paper once it's out. If it's okay with you guys, I can circulate it within the email list.
Assuming that the labor studies group doesn't want money.
Really?
Katie set up a labor college, you know that? It snuck off. They stole some people from Queens to help set that up.
All right. Okay, then we look forward to the paper. And thank you so much again for coming.
Bye-bye.
All right.